Hey, look at this. We're down in Akron, and our crowd keeps growing and growing and growing. More people. For those of you who I have not met, I'm Tom Merrill, and welcome to another edition of Penultimate. So this is session number 4, and I'm super excited because we have Mr. Lieberth here. Mr. Lieberth, Chairman of the Board of the Summit County Historical Society. So it's about another place to be. And also we have students, if you want to wave, these are students from my developmental writing class, and then we have some people here from Akron Summit County Public Library. So today's presentation and what we do today is really going to be wrapped around Mr. presentation. So to kick off, maybe what I'll do is I'm going to share real quick Pear Deck to get going, just to bring us all up to speed, and then we'll get underway with Mr. Lieber's presentation on the subject of John Brown, and then we'll come back to the activity. Sound good? Sound good? Sounds good. Okay. So, if you're not logged on already to Pear Deck, if you would please go ahead and do that. I'm going to share the screen. You can see what I'm doing. Okay, so we're all in here. First thing I want us to know is, what are we doing today? Well, what we're doing today is that we want participants to access resource information and ideas in order to begin working on cohort assignments in this class. This is going to include a sample today of a place PBL on the subject of John Brown and the John Brown Monument. What we're going to do after that is we're going to ask that we all, as participants in Penultimate, place ourselves in the John Brown story through narrative, informational, and persuasive lenses, just by answering a couple of questions. Okay? We'll run through again so that we kind of cover the course assignments, and then we'll also discuss highlights of the next course session. One more thing we're going to do today that I ask all of you to participate in, that includes everybody that's here, whether you're from the library side or the teaching side or the University of Akron side, is to complete an exit slip, if you will, that we'll capture on this Pear Deck program. So I wanted to welcome Mr. Lieberth. Mr. Lieberth is here with, as I said, he's the chairman of the board of the Summit County Historical Society. Mr. Lieberth has been really involved in the city of Akron, and I think I saw it noted somewhere online today that you're a go-to person, which I thought was a really nice statement to get things done in the city of Akron. Mr. Lieberth is very involved in history. He's also been served as the deputy mayor for the city of Akron. And today, as a matter of fact, he did the exact same presentation on, or something very, very similar, on John Brown as part of the Rethinking Race Week at the University of Akron. So we're extremely grateful that he's provisioned time to join us this afternoon, and I know it's been a taxing day for you, but I can't tell you how much all of us appreciate it. So with that said, up on the screen, as you see with Pear Deck, this Pear Deck's available to you at your desktop once you get logged in. If you feel like you want to explore a few things as Mr. Lieberth is talking, there are some live links there for you to follow. You can go kind of research the story as he's speaking. And that said, let's go ahead and move things over so that we are speaking to Mr. Lieberth. And hang on just a second, and I'll make that screen come up the right way for us. Screen section. Mr. Lieberth, if you want to say just a couple of words of welcome, and then I'll go ahead and share your PowerPoint and get us into it.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom. Good afternoon, everyone. It's very nice to be with you today. We're going to be talking a little bit about John Brown And I'm going to try to make the case for you today that he is the single most consequential individual ever to live in Akron or Summit County. I'm going to go through a little bit of his life, a little bit why I think that we can make that case, and then talk a little bit, as Tom said, about the John Brown Monument that's here in Akron and about the John Brown home that's in the custody of the Summit County Historical Society. So Tom, let me ask you, I don't have a nervous tick, but when I nod my head consistently, that's Tom's signal to change the deck for me. So Tom, why don't we get into the deck as well?
That sounds great. Here we go, guys. Whoops, hang on a second. We're sharing the screen, and now, if we've done everything correctly, like magic, Cleveland, can you see this aerial shot? And Euclid, can you see the aerial shot?
Yes. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Okay.
We're underway.
Let's move ahead a couple of slides there, Tom.
Okay.
Because what I want to tell you, first of all, is that when we started Rethinking Race Week at the University of Akron, commemorating an anniversary of the town meeting on race that was hosted at the University of Akron in 1997. And it was President Clinton's attempt to verify the kind of racial conversations that were going on in our community. In 1997, Akron had fully embraced something called the Beacon Journal series that was a question of color. It won the Pulitzer Prize that year for community involvement. And so as we sat on the stage of E.J. Thomas Hall with the President of the United States and about 60 people, here is my lasting memory. Me telling the President of the United States that it was time for him to stop talking. A Beacon Journal cartoonist captured the moment thusly with me saying, look, I don't care if you are the President of the United States. I said, wrap it up. I had somebody whispering in my ear, please tell him to stop talking. The second panel of that cartoon is him grabbing me by the throat and me saying, well, you said to be blunt. That's what I remember about that. But as 60 people took the stage that day, I indicated to them that in addition to the Beacon Journal series and the community conversation we were having about race, Akron was the perfect site, in fact, for us to have this conversation, since we'd been having this conversation for over 140 years. In 1851, Sojourner Truth addressed the National Women's Rights Convention on North High Street in Akron, and she is remembered famously for the speech that she gave that day, Ain't I a Woman? It's kind of a classic. And then in 1854, there was an African-American barber in Akron whose name was Jim Worthington. Akron was really a hotbed of anti-slavery, of abolition activity. And so this was the time of the Fugitive Slave Law. It was a dreadful law of the United States that allowed free people of color in the North to be re-enslaved just by being captured and taken back over the Mason-Dixon line and into custody. That was the basis of 12 Years a Slave, incidentally, the movie that came out 2 years ago. Anyhow, Jim Worthington was popular. He was a barber. And when these two phony U.S. Marshals appeared in Akron asking for him, suddenly the people of the town gathered together. They sounded the alarm. They gathered on the train platform here on Howard Street. And in Akron in 1850, the town looked a little bit about like this. And they immediately started having a conversation of tar and feathers. Suffice it to say that when the train came in, the phony marshals who had been sent by a slaveholder in Kentucky got on the train and left Jim Worthington behind. And then there's John Brown, the person that we're going to be talking about today. There are history scholars who've spent their lives delving into the causes of the American Civil War, or the war between the states, or the War of Southern Rebellion, or the War of Northern Aggression. It depends on which side of the Mason-Dixon line you grew up on as to what you call that conflict. And there are psychologists who have written well-researched papers and trying to diagnose John Brown's contradictory behavior from a distance of 150 years. Amazon actually lists 3,132 book entries on its site relating to John Brown and Harper's Ferry. So today, I want to take a look at his life, and for those of you who may not be familiar with it, and to report on how the Summit County Historical Society is trying to preserve that 10-year span that he made Akron his home. He is one of the most consequential Americans of the 19th century, and as again, I would say, it's my belief he's the single most consequential individual to ever come from Akron and Summit County. And the Smithsonian Channel recently produced a series of documentaries called Civil War 360. They said that this period of the American Civil War began with the shots fired at Harper's Ferry by John Brown and his men, and ended with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And of course, we're going to commemorate the 150th anniversary of Lincoln's assassination this April. John Brown's life is filled with contradictions. He was at the same time prayerful and pious, generous and kind and knowledgeable, and he was tough and he was unreasonable, he was rigid, he was angry, and he was vengeful. So the contradictions in his life make up the title of this presentation, Martyr or Madman. The writer and historian Evan Carton says that John Brown was the first United States citizen committed to absolute racial equality. Let me give you an example. I don't know if you can come back to the camera or not, but is that easy for you to do, Tom?
Oh, not very.
All right, then we'll leave it alone. Besides, you don't want to look at me sitting in this chair anyhow, so that's fine. Let me give you an example. Among abolitionists, there were several different kinds of temperaments that guided abolition fervor. One was kind of a neutrality, like, yeah, this is a bad thing, but let's not upset all the cotton growers and cause the prices to rise in all our clothing. A second would have been slavery is horrible, it ought to be ended. But what we really ought to do is that we ought to gather those African slaves and remove them, recolonize them, back to Africa. That was a very popular sentiment, and one that was even held by Abraham Lincoln for a while. And then there were those who were absolutely violent abolitionists, that this was a kind of evil that had to be snuffed out. And John Brown was even in another category of people who were abolitionists, because even among abolitionists, many believed that people of African descent at the time, were inferior human beings, but they were against slavery. John Brown was one of the very few people who invited African slaves to his table at his home to have dinner with them and to dine with his family. That was why he was, in part, exceptional. He was a devout Protestant in the Calvinist tradition. He came to believe that violence was not only acceptable to achieve the means of eradication of African slavery, but he believed that violence was probably necessary. And his methods, which included human butchery, bloodshed, death, remain controversial, of course, even to this day. Let me tell you a little bit about his life. John Brown was born on May 8th of 1800 in West Torrington, Connecticut. At age 5, his father, Owen, moved to Hudson on the Western Reserve of Connecticut. And this was a time as people from New England were coming to this part of Ohio through Cleveland and Euclid and Youngstown and Warren and Akron, the Western Reserve of Connecticut. Imagine the unimaginable hardships that they faced. There were dense forests. There were no roads to speak of. There were no readily available stores for supplies. And so they lived lives of great deprivation and real terror very often. There were still wild animals, and there still were some Native Americans on the frontier who were a little upset in 1800 about their land being taken away from them. And so there were occasional skirmishes with Indian people. John's mother died when he was only 8 years old. Some people say that when you try to examine him psychologically, that contributed a lot, that loss, to his whole makeup. He had very little formal education, and like other men of the time, he went into business. Different businesses, and every one of them failed. He lived 59 years, and there was never a day that he was out of debt. At age 20, he married Dianthe Lusk. He had 7 children. 2 died in infancy. She died after 12 years of marriage, leaving him with 5 children to raise alone. Then he married Mary Ann Day, with whom he had 13 more children. So if you're counting, yes, that's 20. But 5 of their children all died daughter developed pneumonia and died in her father's arms. Amelia was scalded to death in Akron in 1846. Ellen died in 1849. So when we talk about his psychological makeup, imagine it was loss after loss after loss that he experienced in the first 30 years or so of his life. In 1844, Colonel Simon Perkins was one of the wealthiest men in the Western Reserve. It was his father who founded Akron, and who was a very wealthy landowner, not just in Summit County and Akron, but through Warren and Trumbull County as well. He farmed about 150 acres of land right around his stone mansion. It's still the home today of the Summit County Historical Society. They raised cattle there for beef and for milk, but this was an area that was just studded with rocks, a lot of hills in this area. So what he could support was sheep, and sheep production became the nation's first organized industry, and wool was the first international trade commodity. Ohio became a major producer of wool and mutton. Now, when you look at those pictures of all those Civil War soldiers, whether they were in Union uniforms or Confederate uniforms, all those uniforms were made of wool. So Ohio was a very important provider of this product. Colonel Perkins wanted to raise a large flock of the very finest sheep, and he had heard that John Brown had one of the area's most developed talents for breeding and raising sheep and the grading of wool. In 1844, Brown moved his family to this two-room cottage. It's still there at Copley Road and Diagonal Road today, which is maintained by the Society. And he described this as the best circumstances his family had ever known. Two of his sons were in jail in Akron, but he had to pay rent of $30 per year for these two rooms. He got a garden, he got all the wood that he needed for fires, and with Colonel Perkins, they agreed that he would get half the profits or share half the losses of this enterprise. This is a photo taken in about 1880. It's the closest we have to what it looked like while the Browns were living there. American wool was generally regarded as inferior to Europe's. Brown traveled there for the Perkins partnership, and he said that, the problem with American farmers is they were sort of ignorant of what made their wool valuable. And he tried to educate farmers that they just couldn't gather wool from the entire flock, regardless of what kind of sheep they had, with all the dirt and all the sticks and the mud and burrs that were stuck to it, and just bundle it up and send it off to market. He started encouraging farmers to clean their wool, to grade it separately by its quality. And what happened was that wool suddenly became much more valuable. And the Perkins Brown flock was reputed to be and published in national magazines as the finest flock of sheep in the United States at the time. In 1852, they had 13 head of Merino and Saxony sheep. Now, the presence of this large herd prompted Akronites of the time to refer to the area around Portage Path and Copley Road as Mutton Hill. And this is a logo that we've developed recently to rebrand these two properties to remember the legacy that Perkins and Brown left behind. Now, between 1844 and 1854, when his family made their home here in Akron, Brown was in and out a lot. He spent a lot of his time in Springfield, Massachusetts. This is a picture of the Springfield, Massachusetts Armory. It was right across the street from the depot where he gathered wool from American farmers to ship overseas. But he sort of kept his eye on this armory, this arsenal, watching the comings and goings of the soldiers, which was intelligence that he would put to his own use a few years later. Now, the partnership was successful for a while, but Brown was no businessman. He didn't pay all of his bills on time. Soon the partnership got behind in debts, and they pretty much failed. And by 1854, after trying to accumulate as much money as they could, Perkins and Brown ended their partnership, and Brown relocated his family to North Elba, New York. Now, let's talk about this man. In 1837, in Hudson, at the age of 37, he had already been south in his travels. He had already seen people in bondage. It horrified him. And so he stood at the Hudson Congregational Church and said, "Here before God, in the presence of these witnesses, I consecrate my life to the destruction of slavery." Over the years that he worked for Perkins, he would cross the Ohio River many times into Virginia, which today would be West Virginia, and into Pennsylvania. And frequently he would run across runaway slaves, and he would help transport them across the Ohio River. Sometimes he would hand them off to other conductors on the Underground Railroad, and if he felt that they were in imminent danger, he would bring them back to Akron. He would conceal them in his home here or in his barn until they could be delivered north across Lake Erie to Canada safely. Now, Colonel Perkins' wife, Grace, was not a fan. Here's what she wrote. He was always concerning himself with Negroes, often having several hidden about his place at once. Grace Perkins thought that Brown was crude and his children were disreputable, and she was much more sophisticated than the Brown family was. One colleague of Brown's in the Ohio Underground Railroad said he had a single consuming idea in life, and that was to free the black man. He had no other aim. Now, these contradictions are apparent in the account written in 1898 by Daniel Hadley in McClure's magazine. McClure's at the time was one of the best-read magazines in the United States. In 1852, Hadley was an attorney in Akron when Brown was living here, and he was a justice of the peace. And in this article, he writes about his encounters with Brown, two of them, which I think show these contradictions. Brown had accused his neighbor, Mr. Ruggles, of stealing sheep. Well, Mr. Ruggles was offended, took exception, and he hid out on the road that he knew Brown would be traveling, and he ambushed him. He was armed with a hickory sapling, and he started beating Brown. Brown folded his arms across his chest and took the beating. He told Mr. Hadley later that he struck him 20 times or more until blood was running down into his boots. After the beating, he went to Mr. Hadley's office and said, "I want him arrested." He was arrested. He was fined $20, and Hadley reports that Brown was satisfied that justice had been done. Well, Brown clearly was reading the New Testament. That turned the other cheek part. When he returned to Hadley's office on August 13th of 1854, he apparently had been reading some books of the Old Testament of the Bible. He was living in North Elba by that time. Hadley looked up in his law office one day, and there was John Brown standing in his doorway. He read aloud a letter from his sons about the savagery of the border ruffians in Kansas, where they had butchered 54 free state men. And Brown told Hadley that he had heard God's voice, that he must slay the wrongdoers, in a sense, to smite his enemies in the Old Testament sense. And that night, Hadley arranged a secret meeting in Akron at a church, or a school rather, on High Street. And he brought together a dozen or so of Akron's community leaders who he knew were all sensitive and favored abolition. They needed to meet under the cover of darkness, so they used the back door and wouldn't be detected. And by the next morning, according to Hadley's report, they had collected 21 revolvers, 26 rifles, swords, sabers, knives, and $300 cash. Hadley himself confessed to having a box of muskets, rifles, shipped to Brown that were intended to go to the state militia in Columbus. One of the heroes in this story is a great leader of Akron, Lucius Bierce. General Bierce was headed a militia in the War of 1812. He had guns in his home that he gave to John Brown, and he also contributed a 12-pound cannon from his Army days that found its way to Kansas and was used. And it's pretty clear that the swords donated by Lucius Bierce went to Kansas, and they were likely used in the very bloody raid that Brown and his sons and 4 of his sons and some other men conducted along Osawatomie Creek in the Kansas Territory. If you want more details, I can give you more details later. Let's suffice it to say he became an outlaw. He was wanted by the federal government, and that's one of the reasons that he grew the beard that he grew when he went to Kansas. This is the cabin that he occupied. And the last time he came through Akron in 1859, just 2 months before Harper's Ferry, he collected even more cash, more gold, more silver, more weapons that were used in the raid at Harper's Ferry. Now, Brown had met with other abolitionists of the time. He met with Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass. Harriet Tubman favored the raid on Harper's Ferry and had planned to join him, but she became ill. Frederick Douglass was not so sure of it. He thought that the violence that would come about would set back their cause, so he was not in favor of it. A man named Gerrit Smith, who was a prominent abolitionist at the time in New York, shared Brown's frustration that the idea of moral persuasion and political action was failing. And they both had concluded, and in Brown's words, that the owners of slaves had to feel the stick. So Smith became one of the Secret Six who funded Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. Harper's Ferry was at a critical junction of the Shenandoah and Potomac rivers, and the U.S. arsenal was located. It's not far from Washington. Today, it's about an hour and 15 minutes drive north and west of Washington, D.C. Brown believed that what he could do at Harper's Ferry was to create enough disruption in the slave ownership and among slave owners that he really thought 1,000 slaves would rise up against their owners and kill them and disable slavery throughout the South. The night before the raid on the arsenal, Brown and his men captured this bridge at Harper's Ferry. They headed to the arsenal. There was a great amount of coverage at the time. These drawings in Harper's Weekly and in Leslie's national publication, artists captured the details of the drawing as they attacked the arsenal, as the Union, at that time the Federal Army, arrived and tried to stop Brown and kill him. In the early part of the 20th century, the firehouse that Brown and his men had holed up in became a tourist attraction, and even today this building is still there, and it's maintained by the National Park Service as a national monument to the Harper's Ferry raid. And who was the general sent from Washington to quell the disturbance created by John Brown? Robert E. Lee, a general you might have heard of, who later switched sides in the war on slavery. Brown, of course, was wounded, not fatally, but wounded badly. Two of his sons were killed in the violence and in the battle, Watson and Oliver. His son Frederick had died in the battles in Kansas, so Brown himself sacrificed 3 of his sons to this violence. The newspapers covered him widely. He was standing with help in the courtroom. You see the cot there. Remember that the raid was in mid-October of 1859, and his trial was conducted immediately thereafter, and he was hanged December 2nd. So here was a man who was so injured he couldn't stand on his own 2 feet. They just laid him out on the cot in the courtroom, and the people of Akron were outraged by this. He was front page news in Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper. In other papers at the time, the artists portrayed virtually every aspect of the raid and the trial, his wife, and in his cell. Harper's Weekly sent an artist to draw his picture and the picture of the other men who would be hanged with him. And here he was illustrated in his cell receiving his death warrant. The trial was noisy and boisterous, and by all accounts, they put him on a wagon to take him to his hanging. And on December 2nd, he was hanged, and they were so worried about what might happen. 1,000 federal soldiers were marshaled together that morning to protect the area, fearful that, in fact, Brown's ultimate goal of having a slave uprising might actually occur. There was a face in the crowd that day among those 1,000 soldiers and thousands of other people, a man whose name was John Wilkes Booth. The night that he was hanged, these are 3 of his sons who put on military uniforms for Kansas. The night that he was hanged, December 2nd, that day in Akron, the bells tolled for an hour. The people of Akron gathered at what they called an indignation meeting at the Empire Hall. And this man, Lucius Pierce, again declared, "Our old friend and neighbor was the first martyr in the irrepressible conflict of liberty and slavery. His blood has sanctified the gallows and made it a fit emblem of liberty." The editors of the Beacon were outraged. They felt he hadn't gotten a fair trial. He should have pleaded insanity. They called it a mockery of justice. And Brown himself lent himself to great publicity, as I said, during the trial. He was buried in North Elba, New York. And then here's a piece from 1893 at the World's Fair. This is sort of what happened for the 40 years after his death. They were handing out souvenirs. This particular souvenir on the reverse side had Brown's last written words, and the ones he is most famous for: I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. And he did destabilize the South. His attack at Harper's Ferry didn't do what he wanted it to do. It didn't cause a slave uprising, but it did create great fear and restlessness among slave owners who thought this might be possible. One of the reports at the time was that some of the enslaved peoples felt the shackles get just a little tighter as slave owners sort of clamped down on what little freedom they gave them. They were really concerned and afraid, and there was a great deal of instability about the people that they had enslaved. And so what John Brown did was that he really sparked the war that caused the deaths of 350,000 people. One of the bloodiest conflicts in American history, of course, the bloodiest. Ohio furnished about 300,000 troops. We had about 6,000 people from Akron alone. 35,000 people from Ohio lost their lives. And the soldiers from Akron are remembered today at Glendale Cemetery. Brown became mythologized to a large degree with pictures like this. After the war, people like this guy, S.K. Donovan, gave speaking tours about scenes and incidents of Harper's Ferry. He was a newspaper correspondent at the time. One of the most famous mythologies was John Brown kissing the baby of a black slave as he walked down the steps to the gallows. It's pictured in several versions of it here. As best all the researchers can tell, that incident never happened, but it certainly was an emotional response to what was happening at Harper's Ferry. This is a item that's in the Library of Congress, Heroes of the Colored Race. It says at the bottom, with Frederick Douglass in the center, the two first black senators and then look down there in the center at the bottom, that's John Brown, pictured in this Heroes, along with Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant. Here is and of course the tune was the one that we're most familiar with at the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Julia Ward Howe hated the words, and when she heard the Union soldiers singing these words, so she changed the words to today's Battle Hymn of the Republic. And there were other songs too. If that was a song of marching, this was a song of mocking. This was a song created by slave owners to mock John Brown's hanging. So what happened here in Akron then during this period of time? Well, in 1910, the German-American Alliance in Akron felt that if nobody else was going to erect a monument to John Brown, they would. So, as Mr. Merrill said, I mean, there was a monument in Akron that we're going to pay a little bit of attention to today, and this is it. Let's see the second picture there. Good, Tom. This is the plaque that's on the pillar erected by the German-American Alliance, August 21st, 1910. When it was dedicated, 8,000 people showed up. Now, in 1910, there were still soldiers who fought in the Civil War still living in Akron, including this man here. And this is Jason Brown, John Brown's son. He was then in his 80s. And although he abhorred slavery, he was a pacifist. He refused to participate in any of the violence. And he made Akron his home. And Jason Glendale Cemetery in Akron, along with members of his family as well. So, as we look at this pillar, the stone column actually was in existence before this monument. It was a pillar at the first Summit County Courthouse. And so they had removed the pillar to make way for the new courthouse, the one that's there today, as a matter of fact. It's 6 feet tall. It's made of sandstone tapered drums. It has a sandstone ball on top. Originally, it had a bronze eagle that has been missing for more than 50 years. And the geologist for the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, Joe Hannibal, says that he thinks the column was probably quarried in the spot where the Akron City Hall is today on High Street. You'll notice there's a parking lot right next to City Hall. That was a stone quarry, and this was probably where the sandstone was gathered. And then in 1938, a new monument was added with a new plaque, a new picture of John Brown. Benches were put around the outside, and an organization called the Negro, 25 years, they removed these stones from a house that was being demolished on East Exchange Street, and then they added the stones, a seating area, a plaza, and the new markers, and rededicated the monument in 1938. Almost all of the work was done by men who were in the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, Franklin Roosevelt's effort to put men back to work. And then there's another monument here. Nobody knows about this one at all, so I'll let you in on a little secret. There are all these stones that are littered throughout the landscape here at the Brown property. With a bronze plaque on it. And it honors the women who founded the Home and School League, a predecessor to the PTA. They took care of poor children. They offered what today we would call enrichment activities for children in the 1920s. I believe it's the only monument to women in Summit County. I know of no other stone monument to a woman in Summit County other than this one, and it's entirely random that it was placed here at the Brown Monument. In October 2009, we conducted ceremonies commemorating the 150th anniversary of Harper's Ferry. We had about 100 people there that day. We celebrated it with music, and we celebrated it with a reenactment of some of Brown's speech. That's the actor Neil Thackerberry portraying John Brown. So today we have the John Brown home. This was located at an intersection of two major highways. The one highway you know about, it was the Portage Path. It was the historic highway that Native peoples traveled to get from the Big Bend in the Cuyahoga River to the start of the Tuscarawas River. They portaged canoes over this route, following an animal route that had been there for 10,000 years. So both Perkins Mansion and the Brown House sit on the Portage Path. The other road that intersects it was a stagecoach road that ran from Warren to Worcester. So there were a lot of people who traversed this area. Today we made two rooms that Brown and his family lived in on the first floor. Still are there, and the floors are the same floors that Brown and his family would have used. The barn is still there as well. There were additions over the years. A porch was put on, and later a tower that you'll see in another picture. But you'll see over to the left there was an addition there added to the Brown house, and very few people know what this addition is or what it was for. George Todd Perkins, who gave the land for the Brown Monument, incidentally, and started Children's Hospital 125 years ago this year. George Todd Perkins was the president of the B.F. Goodrich Company. B.F. Goodrich Company at the time in the late 1890s, there were no cars then, so they were making fire hose, and that was important because there was a lot of wooden buildings and fires were a constant threat, and they made bicycle tires. They made one other product that they never could get quite right: golf balls. And so they needed a place in Akron to play golf. So George Todd Perkins took land around this house in about 1895, and he created a 3-hole golf course. And they added this room at the left, and that was the first home of the Portage Country Club. So today it's one of Akron's finest and upscale establishments, but this is where it started. And so this is sort of what the house looks like today. The barn is still there. You'll see the tower there on the right and the Portage Country Club room on the left. We received a state capital grant this year of $50,000, and we are using that money to assess this house, every board, every wire, every pipe. And so our hope is that within 2 years we can go back to the state and ask for sufficient funding in order to completely restore the John Brown house as a museum on abolition and slavery, so that we have maintained this strong connection with what we have as our heritage in Akron with the Civil War. We have soldiers who are entombed and who are memorialized at Glendale Cemetery, but Akron's real contribution, his contributions and the people's contributions. Let me talk for a moment about the John Brown Monument, because I know that that's one of the subjects that Dr. Chura and Tom will want to get into. When we went up to look at the monument in about 1995, we found that it had been completely vandalized. Everything imaginable was littered there, and I'll let you use your imaginations about the things that were found there. Black paint, spray-painted graffiti on the monument. And the city fixed it up with no plan for how we could protect it in the future. The zoo needed additional property to expand on, and so as they began to expand onto the Perkins Park property, we enclosed the entire John Brown Monument with a fence. That protected it from vandalism, and it has worked for these last 15 years or so. But at the same time, when we fenced it in, we also prohibited, in a sense, the public ever from visiting it in any random way. So today and this year, we have tried to schedule tours of the site, and we take people up there. The zoo unlocks the gate for us, and we do guided tours of the monument. We're going to do one tomorrow, incidentally. If you'd like to join us, if you come to the zoo parking lot at 3 o'clock, you can join us for the tour. We're actually doing a tour of African American historic sites tomorrow, and it will leave from the Circle Drive in front of Bookdale Hall at 2 o'clock tomorrow, and it'll end at the zoo and the Brown Monument at about 2:45 or so. So if you'd like to come up and see it with us tomorrow, you'd be more than welcome to do that. We don't have a plan for the house, for the monument right now. We did put a group together back in 2000. We did look at a number of options. The stars haven't aligned yet to know what the best way is to preserve it, to open it, to offer it as a site. One proposal has been to move it, to relocate it. We actually identified a site at the corner of Cedar and Copley Roads to move the monument to. Nobody has pursued that yet. The site itself is beautiful. If you come up there with us tomorrow or sometime in May, we've talked to Dr. Chura about opening it up for him and his class. You'll see that it has a gorgeous view of downtown Akron from up there. And so it would be a shame in a way to move it. But on the other hand, we want it in a place where it can also be seen. One of the other things that we've done, I think I have a couple more slides here, Tom, is that a year ago we had not really, let me use the word exploited, our history as an Underground Railroad site. And so the U.S. Congress created an entity called the Network to Freedom of Underground Railroad sites. It's how they recognize Underground Railroad sites and how they offer some money to keep them up. And so we were able to, last May, to become a part of the Network to Freedom, meaning that we are now part of the Underground Railroad sites that are recognized around the country. And that's part of the reason why that we want to develop this house and the property and to restore it in some way to the memory of John Brown and all the abolitionists who lived here. And so you begin to see why, one, I think I would call him highly contradictory, and two, why I think he's the most consequential person ever to live in Akron and Silicon. And now, we can talk if you like.
I would like that very much. I would like that very much. So when I first tripped across this, it was at a class over at the University of Akron that was taught by Dr. Chura, which you'll hear from later on in this class. And Dr. Chura was talking about this fact that near the Akron Zoo, on the hillside overlooking it, where children come and they get field trips to the zoo all the time, wouldn't it be neat if they were able to walk up the hill and take in this stone monument, maybe an interpretive center, if we could locate one there, and learn about, not while they're going to the zoo, then learn about kind of where this hillside's history kind of lies. and the fact that, a flock of sheep was raised here. And what was the wool used for? Oh, it was used for the Civil War uniforms. Well, who raised the sheep? Well, he helped to touch off the Civil War, and his name is John Brown. And then continue on from the monument to his home and then to Simon Perkins' mansion. But right now, that monument's buried in the woods. Literally buried in the woods. Right?
It's not very accessible. In fact, I would tell you that we did a tour last Friday as well as part of Rethinking Race Week at the university, and we're going to do it again tomorrow. And the zoo has been enormously cooperative with us. And the head of landscaping at the zoo invested, I don't know, dozens of hours last week trying to get a truck up there and paving a path for us. So last week we were able to get up there. It's not easy. I mean, it's a little bit strenuous to get up the hill. And hopefully by tomorrow he'll also be cleaning it up, whatever snow has fallen the last 2 days. But we've warned people, prepare for a strenuous hike and wear clothing appropriate for the weather. So tomorrow's going to be cold and tonight's going to be snowy. It's not easy to know what to do with this. It just isn't. It would be easy to move it. It would have cost us only $100,000. And in the great scheme of things in municipal government, $100,000 is not a lot of money in a $1 billion budget that the city has. But there are people who don't want to see it moved. They want to leave it where it is. We can leave it where it is, and the zoo's fine with that. But then they have to protect it, and they don't have a way right now to monitor it, because this is outside of any of the animal exhibits. So the zoo's over here, and the monument's up here on the hill next to the parking lot. So this is a work in progress, and it's one that they're willing to be part of. They've always been part of our conversation, and they've always been very cooperative with us. They did a magnificent job 5 years ago during the sesquicentennial. They really cleaned up the hillside. I sent some city crews up there at the time too. We trimmed the trees. We laid down some wood chips so that we could actually have a ceremony up there. So it remains to be seen what will be done with it and how it might become more accessible. Any questions about John Brown or about some of the craziness that you heard in the presentation of his contradictory behavior? Isn't he fascinating?
He is tremendously fascinating. Dr. Broadway, I know you're out there in Cleveland land. Do you want to kind of shepherd a question or two this way?
Yeah.
Is everybody awake in Cleveland?
Yes.
Yes.
Right away.
All right, good.
I have a question for you guys, and for you, Mr. Liebert, is I've heard that John Brown's memory is changing. That there was a time where now there's kind of a return to this idea of martyr. Where do you think things fall in terms of how people look at John Brown and maybe even people from outside this area?
It's like all of the history that is being written. I mean, all of you have read perhaps some of Doris Kearns Goodwin's books about Lincoln. Of course, the movie Lincoln was based on Doris Kearns Goodwin books. Wouldn't you think 150 years after his death we'd know everything there was to know about Lincoln? And yet it keeps getting rewritten. And what happens is that historians now return to primary sources, the words of the people at the time. They try to sort through the mythology. And here's a man who was so mythologized in the last half of the 19th century. He was held up in the North as an icon. He was considered depraved and a butcher in the South. And so these contradictions were very obvious depending on which side of the Mason-Dixon line you were on. But the first real biography of him was written in the early 20th century and had tons of errors in it. It was written in the style of the time, which was a lot of personal opinion and observation as opposed to literal research of the original documents. So I have 15 books on John Brown in my library, and half of them have been written in the last 10 years. So there's been a new renewal, as you suggest, to go back and look at this life. There are psychologists and psychiatrists who have written essays in another book by Dr. Finkelman, looking at his mental illness diagnosis, mental health diagnosis. The question is, was he crazy? Was he a madman? Was he psychotic? Did he have personality disorders that manifested themselves in this very strong way? But as you look at his life, you begin to get a new picture of him as a person who was driven. And that is the single characteristic of him that lasts, how driven he was. He was single-minded. He sacrificed 3 sons. He, lost a wife. He lost 5 children to disease, in addition to his 3 sons who were killed in the violence. He traveled a lot, was away from home when his wife and children were without him. I mean, he lived a life of great deprivation in many ways, single-mindedly focused on abolition and the end of slavery. And that drive led him to believe that unless he created the violent spark that would eventually start the Civil War, no one else would do it. And so it continues to be a topic of historical research and observation. Would the Civil War have started without this spark? Well, probably. It couldn't have. Slavery couldn't have lasted. People think that Brown concluded properly that the slaveholders had to feel the stick. There had to be something violent to shake them out of their attitude of that doing business as usual would not be good enough. That is, keeping people enslaved. But in the states that had slaves was $3 billion. The value of all the real estate in the South was less than that. So slaves really were at the core of the Confederacy, and many would say of the Civil War. And today I think the attitude about, there was a lot of time when people were apologists for the Civil War. Well, it was a war between the states. It was about states' rights, and people were confused. There's less confusion today. It was fundamentally about slavery.
You've been in public service for a long time, in public service in Northeast Ohio. What do you think that is the special chemistry, if there is any, in Northeast Ohio that kindled a fire in John Brown? What is that? Does that exist at all?
Yeah.
Would it have happened somewhere else?
Don't know. I do a presentation about leadership in Akron over the last 180 years. And one of the things I talk about is that this part of Ohio, the Western Reserve of Connecticut, meaning Cleveland and Lorain and Elyria and Youngstown and Warren, were settled by Connecticut Yankees from New England. And they brought with them this very strong faith, this Protestant faith. They had a very rigid moral background. Our first newspaper editor in Akron was a man named Samuel Lane. And his first newspaper was called The Buzzard, because he said that was the bird what picked the filth off the street. And so you begin to get some sense of this strong moral sense. And I show how that continues today in Akron. I show how the fact that in Akron, at least, we've had very little scandal over the years. Our size of our community is proportionate in a sense that it's right-sized. You can't talk to anybody for more than a few minutes without finding a common connection. I always say there's 2 degrees of separation of people in Akron. And so there are other examples of how this strong moral sense continues today. Now, I don't mean to exclude Cleveland or our viewers or listeners in Lorain, but in Akron, I would tell you that when the United Way did a survey some years ago about volunteerism, they found that Akron, Ohio had more hours of volunteer activity per capita than any city in the United States. And you have to remember that after 9/11, Akron contributed more money to the people of New York City than any other city did per capita. We bought a fire truck, 2 police cars, and 3 that we have this continuity of what I would call a strong moral discipline and fiber? I think so. I think there is other evidence of it as well. I could make the case for it.
Well, one of the things that's fascinating is we sit here, you're talking to teachers, librarians, teachers-to-be, and we're all sitting here asking ourselves the question of how do we better and further engage students, right? How do we get disengaged or disinterested kids involved in literacy, excited about stories, excited about self-expression? I think some of the things that you're talking about with respect to what is the special chemistry of our groups is great medicine for us to think about as teachers, as librarians, as people that are working with you.
Well,
So
there are a lot of commonalities among all mammals. We used to say that only humans have the gift of speech. That's not true. We now know that other animals, porpoises, for example, have the gift of speech. They've even found that elephants have the gift of speech in the sense that through sound they're able to communicate specific things. So what makes us different? We're the only animal that tells stories. And so storytelling becomes really the hallmark of who we are as a people. And you're absolutely right. We need to engage young people through these kinds of stories. I think young people like gruesome stuff, right? Don't they love gruesome stuff? I used to say that on the tour of the Simon Perkins Mansion, the single exhibit that got the most attention from fifth graders, especially boys, was the hangman's noose for the last person to be hanged in Summit County. So we have that element in our stories about John Brown. There's a lot of gruesome stuff there, but if that becomes a way to engage the kind of the extremeness of the story, the memory, you might have an opportunity to talk a little bit about how strongly he felt about enslaved peoples and begin to talk about enslaved peoples. I don't know how many people have seen 12 Years a Slave. It's pretty gruesome. It's pretty horrifying. Django was another movie, pretty horrifying. But yet these are based on real stories that really illustrate that part of our history. One of the ways I had hoped to illustrate this history, last September, I brought a flock of sheep to the Perkins Mansion. And we're now looking for funding in hopes of bringing a flock of sheep to the Perkins Mansion this summer between April and November to do a couple of things. One, the sheep will maintain our lawn for us. Secondly, they'll create an ongoing and constant visitor attraction for people to revisit the Perkins Mansion frequently because herding sheep with dogs is really cool, incidentally. So we think that would be another way to enliven the story.
very cool.
Did anybody have any comments or questions at all? If not, I could easily go on or leave.
Well,
I could do either one.
Yeah, I'll tell you what. No, this is great because what we're going to do is we're going to do some facilitated questions real quick. Mr. Lingworth, I cannot thank you enough. You've been fantastic.
Thank you.
And our thanks to the Summit County Historical Society as well for everything you're doing.
Thank you.
What I'm going to do, guys.
Thank you. So, does that mean that I'm allowed to leave then?
You can if you'd like.
All right,
or
so
if you
long
wanna see
Cleveland,
some
so long
answers.
Lorraine, so long everybody here. Thank you.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to get us over here. Everybody see that on the screen? We are back with our wonderful Pear Deck. Now, if for everybody in this class and everybody in Euclid and also at Cleveland Parma Snow, if you're not seeing Pear Deck on your screen, if you can click your tab to get there. Is everybody there? Pretty much everybody? Everybody on Pear Deck? Same screen? So I'd like you to consider this question, please. And it's, as we've talked about in previous penultimate classes, we're talking about the issue of curare. We're going to use the curare progressive. We're going to talk about the future. We're going to think about the future. Also talk to my writing class about this. We're going to talk about the future. Is John Brown a hero or a traitor in your mind? Is he a hero or a traitor in your mind? Persuade others to your point of view, would you please? And when you're done commenting, if you go ahead and click post, with thoughts or ideas with your idea why or why not, we'll go ahead and start kind of collecting these and kind of look through and see what everybody has to say about this. So we're saying John Brown was a hero because he stood up for his beliefs no matter how wrong or right they were. He was willing to die for his cause, and that makes him a hero. We're calling him a hero. After his story and his views, I believe that he helped more than he caused harm. He stood up for what he believed in and continued to fight for what he thought was right. Hero, patriot. Just ahead of his time, he was a hero and a patriot because he had the ability to see the destruction that slavery brought to this country. Here's somebody that's got a different point of view. He's neither. He was an early terrorist who killed people to achieve his political ends. He had the right goal but the wrong methods. It's an interesting point of view. Without John Brown, slave owners would be content with the status quo. He shook things up. He shocked and awed the masses. Kind of along the lines of a terrorist comment. Whether they thought that he was a hero or traitor, he made his mark strongly, and it woke up the nation. I think John Brown was a hero. While I do not condone violence, he did stand up for a cause, and he was passionate. Ultimately, by directly confronting the brutality of slavery, he sparked the beginning of the Civil War, which ended with the freeing of slaves. You're following a vision. He's a hero. Many of us think he's a hero. Doing something that we needed to have done in our society. Shakespearean hero, that's an interesting thought. He tried to motivate slaves to free themselves. Thank you very much. We've captured a lot of really good comments. So when we're thinking about those types of questions, we're really talking about persuasive writing. And the question that comes up a lot of times is, how can we kind of get students to be passionate in our classrooms about persuasive writing? Well, we gotta ask them questions that are passionate questions. And the thing about a John Brown story is, regardless of the point of view that you have, it's certainly a story that's filled with passion. Indeed, it helped to touch off the Civil War. Let me ask you another question. Very different kind of question. An analytic question. And I'll bet you the library people in the crowd are going to be really good at this. Okay? What would be 3 kinds of library-based fiction or nonfiction that you might be able to tie to the study of John Brown? Now, you could say, hey, we could look on Wikipedia. Or you could kind of look at it and say, wait a minute. We could be looking at Abraham Lincoln. You could be thinking about maybe novels that have been published more recently, about somebody that is, we have mixed reviews about. What kinds of ideas could we capture? Think of this as a lily pad topic. What kind of books or resources at a library might you be able to uncover and find if the base topic were John Brown and his story? I know it's a hard question. Feel free to use Google if you want. If you have an idea, you can use Google at your screen and go ahead and search something. Search a topic. What does the story of John Brown touch off in you from a literature perspective? Let's start taking a look. You want to finish up and click post. History.com. We're getting lots in now, okay. Here's a neat idea. Sound recordings of the song that were written about him both in the North and in the South. I was trying to envision Battle Hymn of the Republic when Dave was speaking. Articles or books that delve into the idea of whether there could have been a more peaceful way to end slavery, and whether the Civil War could have been averted. Another great idea. Psychologists and psychiatrists had to say about his behavior. That's like a scholarly article. You could almost go to Google Scholar on that. Here's somebody that says Encyclopedia Britannica, good source. Fictional stories that take place during this time that present Brown as a character, as the Good Lord Bird by McBride. That sounds interesting. History.com, American and Civil War History Databases. World Book Advanced, Biography Resource Center. Now, Sarah, these are all databases that we can access here at the library, right?
Yep.
So if I come to the library and I ask you for help with this, I said John Brown, what would you say?
I might say, let's take a look at some databases.
I like the Opposing Viewpoints series and database. Who wrote this? Is this a librarian? You like?
It was over here in Cleveland.
Woo woo.
Cleveland. So what is Opposing Viewpoint series?
Well, there was, I don't know if there still is, but there was a series of books. I don't know which building published, but we had quite a few of them, and it just talked about different sides of various topics.
There is a database through the Ohio Web Library.
So it's Ohio Web Library, and it gives you kind of alternate perspectives.
Yes.
Very cool. Frederick Douglass. There's a really interesting topic. Like some of these people he's connected to, I think, to Emerson and Thoreau. John Brown is. You could go through the religious study, Calvinism, Protestantism. What about the Quaker beliefs? That's really cool. What a cool idea. Oh, here's one that's neat. A picture book of Frederick Douglass. Picture books are a really cool thing because there you can touch on a topic without getting too deep. See whether you're getting, kind of reader or student engagement on that. Neat book ideas. We're going to capture these and publish them back out to you. Setting up a mock trial in your classroom. What a great idea. A database called Freedom Flix, which has videos and ebooks on the Civil War and slavery. These are the types of resources that we start flopping them around between librarians and teachers. And what we're doing is to flesh out a picture of something. Maybe it is that if we share the students' interests, we can start to tailor-make what it is that we're identifying according to those individualized student interests. Couldn't we? Really good. Oh, Red Badge of Courage. Obviously, there's a great one. Gone with the Wind. There's one. Somebody erased their answer and started over. Really good. Okay, so based on time, what I'm going to do, we're going to capture these, and we will publish these things back out to you guys. I want to ask you one more question. Okay, and it's the narrative question. Put yourself in the story. How do you see yourself and your life story reflected when we start to talk about John Brown? Where does this touch your life? you want to go ahead and finish up, I want to give Dr. Broadway a couple minutes to close out today's class. I about fell off my chair when I just started to read these. As a mother of a former soldier who served after 9/11, I think of terrorists who justified murder in the name of God. Now, imagine that this is a student in your class that sees a story this way. Question is, how can you accept the worth that this individual is bringing to the table? Respect that and find ways to leverage that to engage them more fully in literacy instruction. I've had passionate beliefs knowing that there is a right and wrong answer. I differ in how to convince people that's right. Instead, kill them with kindness, as they say. What a beautiful thought. How do you reach that type of a voice, that type of a student? I love this one. I'm an Ohioan and I'm biracial, and I'm always interested in hearing stories about blacks and whites working together during this time period. So as we go through these, what I'm really interested in seeing us do as a class is to come back, once we publish these back out, for us to be able to look at one another, the comments that we've shared, and be able to put ourselves in the place of recognizing that these are the kinds of words our students would say if we asked them. How can we then instruct recognizing that? How can we find what that student values as worthy? And how can we use that as an encouragement to engage in literature, an encouragement to engage in self-expression that is true to that individual? With the two kind of experiences that we went through and stories we went through both last class and this one then, we're pushing off into a new area of this course come next class. What we have that we're looking at is we have this toolkit, the learning standards, we have Karari, our own autobiographical self-reflection. We're looking at places, and we're looking at kind of a constructivist or PBL type of an arrangement or platform. And we're looking at these assignments that we'll be paired up and working on beginning with the next class. The identification of a topic of inquiry that's place-based, and then pushing off into both writing and planning exercises. I'm going to skip this because we're a little out of time. So next time when we come, if you're preparing for that, if you haven't had an opportunity to take a look at the course readings, please do so. And then we're going to get straight into cohort pairings and problem identification once we come back next week. So that said, I want to turn it over to Dr. Broadway, and he has one final kind of to-do on our to-do list.
Okay. Hope everybody can hear me. One of the things as we're going through this workshop is I often get together with Tom and Garth at the end and we sort of debrief. But we'd like to have, one of the things we'd like you to do is give us some data that we can share in our debriefing. And the form I use in my classes, even when I taught middle school, was this thing called an exit slip. So it's a formative assessment. Remember, it is really collecting data. It's not evaluation. So we aren't evaluating you at this point. But it's a formative assessment. But also, I find an exit slip is a means of having my students self-reflect on what they have done during the class meeting session. So we're going to ask you to do an exit slip. Again, the purpose is just a formal, it's a formative assessment, and also a chance to get you to reflect on what your learning was during this particular period. Next slide, Tom, because I don't know how to do it. Okay. What I'd like you to do in terms of exit slips, rather than just simply listing stuff, is give us a thick description. And the definition for a thick description is it's something that describes the particular idea, and it probes and it dives underneath and looks at the particular object from many different perspectives. And so this is a definition by Gasney, a qualitative researcher, about what a thick description is.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and so in this episode, we're asking for a little bit more, or a lot more than just a listing of key points.
Oh,
Next slide. So here is what should be included in the exercise. These 3 points, points A, B, and C. One thing, that's a thought, idea, understanding, concept, perception that you learned during the session. And please limit it to just one thing. And after you have described the one thing that you learned, I'd like you to connect that with yourself as the learner. And the language that's often used is to make a connection between yourself and a text. The text in this case is that one thing that you have learned. And thirdly, part of what we're trying to do here is to model instructional strategies that you might use in your own practice as a librarian or as a classroom teacher.
We're not modeling spelling.
Oh, did I misspell a word? Oh, okay. Spell check for you. Okay.
I'm the worst.
Always write spell check when you can.
All right.
So we'd like you to describe one instructional strategy that we exhibited, the instructors or presenters, or anything that happened during the session that you would use in your practice. So one thing that you learned during the session, how does your learning connect to you as yourself, and one instructional strategy. And Tom will give us a box to put those 3 things in. If you would enter those, we're going to collect those at the end of every session. And one of the things we're going to do at the end is we'd like you to go back and look at all these exercises that you generated during our meetings and look for common themes or ideas. So we will come back to this. So in the next 4 minutes that's left, I'm going to be quiet unless there's any questions. And if you would give us a thick description of one thing that you learned during the session, how does that connect to you as a learner or as a person, as an individual, and one instructional strategy that was used during our instruction during the last hour and a half that you would use in your practice. Any questions? Akron, any questions?
Yeah, I'm going to put the questions back up there just so everybody can.
Right, those are the 3 parts.
What you can do is you can cursor over this and copy it and then paste it in your box on the next slide in the little text box, and then you can just overwrite those. Does that make sense? So go ahead and highlight it, press Control C, get into that text box, and then you'll press Control V. Did you get it back?
Did work.
Just recommend it.
Yeah, I'm good.
Tom, once they're finished, we're finished for the day?
Yeah, once we're finished, we're finished.
Okay, we'll see you Tuesday. Have a good weekend.
See you Tuesday, and if anybody wants to go on that trolley tour to the John Brown Monument, it leaves tomorrow from main campus at the University of Akron, and I sent you an email about it with information in there. If you can possibly break away at 2, that should be a lot of fun. I'm going to try to be there. Thank you all.
Unfortunately, the weather is not that hot, but if you want to go down to the Gorge Metro Park, look at that area that we talked about on Tuesday. Feel free, it's a neat little trip, and see wonderful Cuyahoga Falls, or if even you want to go see wonderful new downtown Kent, you know, that's exciting. So we'll see you next Tuesday. Enjoy yourself.
Thanks.